I was torquing the same bolt for the third time when I realized I was checking the contract again. The paper was creased at the fold lines, worn soft from handling. $200,000 for 18 weeks of Antarctic drilling work. I had 14 weeks left. The math ran through my head automatically. 14 weeks at a little over 11 grand per week, minus the penalty clauses, minus the equipment insurance I'd fronted myself because I don't trust company gear. The number that mattered was $163,000 after deductions. Enough to cover the medical trust for Liam, the kid I'd put in a wheelchair 8 years ago when my drilling rig in the Canadian territories collapsed because I'd approved a budget cut on inspections. Enough for my parents' care home through the end. Enough to restart the education fund for my sister's 3 boys. The bolt was fine. I checked it twice already. My hands needed something to do while my brain calculated whether the life I'd destroyed could be purchased back with enough dangerous work in bad places. I folded the contract and returned it to the inner pocket of my thermal coveralls, then moved down the line to the next connection point on the stabilization coil. That's what we called the massive piece of engineering that regulated the Sabati extraction. The dense vein of prehistoric ice we'd drilled into 4 weeks ago. Ancient material compressed under the Antarctic shelf for millions of years. The ice generated power when we harvested it. Clean energy in quantities that made the station director talk about paradigm shifts and energy independence. I didn't care about paradigms. I cared that the coil was running 6 degrees hotter than the specification sheet said it should. I logged the temperature variance on my personal maintenance tablet. I'd learned years ago that if you want to know what machinery is actually doing, you keep your own records. The facility's official log showed everything within tolerance because Director Ford's new efficiency protocols had redefined what tolerance meant. Ford ran Station Lambda, which was the designation for this entire operation. A vertical drilling facility built into the ice shelf with 4 main levels connected by reinforced airlocks. Surface hangar at the top where the transport craft docked. Habitation and administration 1 level down. Power and engineering, my domain, at level 3. And at the bottom level 4, the drilling platform itself where we pulled the Sabati from 2,000 meters of compressed ice. The coil's heat signature meant the power draw was increasing. We were running the extraction at 140% of projected output, which should have triggered automatic safety cutbacks. Instead, Ford had disabled the cutbacks 3 weeks ago and called it optimization. "You doing okay down here, Tom?" I looked up from the thermal coupling to see Rivera, one of the younger drilling technicians, standing in the workshop entrance. He was 26, good with his hands, asked too many questions. I liked him because he actually read the equipment manuals, instead of just pretending the machinery would cooperate through confidence alone. "Coil's running hot," I said. "You notice anything off with the drill head pressure readings?" Rivera stepped into the workshop and closed the door behind him, which was odd. The workshop was my space on level 3, part of the main engineering hub that housed all the critical systems. Most people just shouted questions from the doorway. "The readings are fine," he said. "I wanted to ask you about something else. You been getting headaches?" I set down my wrench and looked at him properly. He had dark circles under his eyes and kept rubbing his temples like he was trying to massage away pressure. "High altitude adjustment," I said. "Takes a few weeks for your body to stop complaining about the atmospheric pressure differential. We're at sea level, Tom. We're under sea level, technically. And I've been here 4 weeks, same as you." "Then it's stress," I said. "Long shifts, confined spaces, bad lighting. Comes with the job." "Gosh has got them too. So does Patterson and at least 3 people from the drilling crew. We've been calling it the burn because it feels like something's pushing behind your eyes, like heat or pressure building up." He rubbed his temples again. "Started maybe 3 weeks ago. Same time Ford changed all the protocols. 3 weeks. Same time frame as the efficiency adjustments and the disabled safety systems and the stabilization coil running 6 degrees over specification." "You tell Ford about this?" "He said it was documented stress fatigue and that we should focus on output metrics instead of subjective complaints." Rivera said it flatly, like he was quoting a memo. But Tom, I don't think it's stress. I think it's something about the extraction process. Something about being down on level 4 near the Sabatier. The Sabatier material had a faint luminescence to it when you looked at the harvested samples in the cryo-storage units. Dark ice shot through with something that looked like frozen lightning. The company literature called it a stable compression of ambient cosmic radiation, which was a fancy way of saying ancient energy trapped in prehistoric ice. We drilled into it, extracted it, and ran the power through the stabilization coil to make it usable. What happened between the drilling and the coil was mostly speculation and classified corporate research. I was hired to maintain the machinery, not understand the physics. Take it to Patterson in medical, I said. Get him to run a scan if you're worried. Patterson's got the burn too. He told me to stop wasting his time with psychosomatic symptoms. Rivera moved closer and lowered his voice. People are different, Tom. Have you noticed? The way they talk now, like everything's a calculation. Gosh used to joke around during shift handovers. Now she just recites efficiency data. I had noticed. I'd been pretending I hadn't, because noticing meant acknowledging that something was wrong beyond my ability to fix with a wrench and a maintenance log. You can recalibrate machinery. You can't recalibrate people who've decided that conversation is waste and laughter is inefficiency. Keep your head down and do the work, I said. 14 more weeks and we're both out of here with enough money to make it worth the headaches. Rivera looked at me like I'd disappointed him somehow, then nodded and left the workshop. I returned to the stabilization coil and tried not to think about the burn or Gosh's new way of speaking, or the fact that I'd just given the same advice I'd been following for 8 years. Keep your head down, prioritize the payout. Trust that tolerating bad conditions is the same thing as being tough enough to survive them. The coil was still running hot. I made another note in my personal log and checked the time. 1800 hours meant mandatory meal period was starting. Ford had made meals mandatory 6 days ago as part of the optimization protocols. He said scheduled nutrition intake prevented inefficient energy expenditure from irregular eating patterns. What it really meant was we all sat in the cafeteria at the same time while he monitored our caloric consumption. I cleaned my tools and secured the workshop. The walk from level 3 to level 2 took 4 minutes through the main elevator shaft. The facility was built vertically to minimize the surface footprint and maximize drilling depth, which meant everything happened in layers. Surface hangar for logistics, administration and habitation for the humans, engineering for the machinery, drilling platform for the actual work. You spent your days moving up and down between your assigned functions like components in a machine. The cafeteria on level 2 was built to hold 18 people, the full station complement. I walked in and immediately noticed the silence. No conversation, no laughter, no background noise of people being people. Just the sound of utensils against trays and the occasional scrape of a chair. Everyone was present. Everyone was eating. The meal portions had changed. Instead of the usual serving sizes that accounted for the heavy physical labor we did, everything was measured out in precise quantities. I picked up my tray and found it pre-filled. Protein block, carbohydrate portion, vegetable supplement. The portions were smaller than they'd been last week. I sat down across from Dr. Jane Gosh, the station geologist who'd been part of the team that discovered the Sabatier vein. Gosh was 42, brilliant with seismic data, and used to spend meal periods talking about her daughter back in California. Today she was staring at a data tablet while eating, her movements precise and economical. She didn't look up when I sat down. "Evening, Jane," I said. She glanced at me briefly, then returned to the tablet. No greeting, no acknowledgement beyond confirming I'd spoken. I tried again. "How's the seismic mapping going?" "Within expected parameters," she said, still looking at the tablet. "The Sabatier vein remains stable at current extraction rates. Continued optimization protocols suggest we can increase output by an additional 12% before encountering structural resistance." That wasn't how Gosh talked. That was how Ford talked. Clinical, data-focused, stripped of anything personal or inefficient. I looked around the cafeteria at the rest of the crew. Patterson, the medic, eating in silence while reviewing supply inventories. The drilling engineers consuming their meals like fuel intake rather than food. No one was talking. No one was wasting time on conversation. The door opened, and Director August Ford walked in. Ford was 62 but looked ageless in the way very controlled people do. Precise movements, expensive insulated suit that wasn't standard issue, wire-rimmed glasses he kept meticulously clean. He was a logistics coordinator, not a scientist, but he ran Lambda like a perfectly optimized supply chain. He stopped at the front of the cafeteria, and everyone's attention shifted to him immediately, like components responding to a system command. "Good evening," Ford said. His voice was calm and formal, every word measured. "I am here to announce implementation of Phase 2 efficiency protocols. After comprehensive analysis of station performance metrics, I have identified several redundancies that require elimination." He pulled up a display on the wall screen showing a complex flowchart of station systems. First, all secondary safety checks have been reclassified as redundant and will no longer appear on daily task schedules. Primary systems monitoring is sufficient for operational needs. Second, atmospheric control has been optimized to focus on essential zones only. Sections not currently in active use will receive minimal environmental support. Third, backup power systems have been placed in standby mode to reduce wasteful energy distribution. The Sabbaty core now provides 100% of station power requirements, making secondary generators unnecessary. Removing secondary safety checks meant no verification if primary systems failed. Minimal environmental support in unused sections meant if you needed to access those areas in an emergency, you'd be working in potentially lethal conditions. Placing backup power in standby meant if something happened to the Sabbaty extraction, we'd lose all power simultaneously instead of having time to implement emergency protocols. These weren't optimizations. These were the systematic removal of every safety margin that kept a facility like this survivable if anything went wrong. Finally, Ford continued, Level 4 exposure time will be increased. Current data indicates that extended proximity to the extraction process correlates with measurable improvements in cognitive efficiency. Personnel assigned to drilling operations will now maintain 4-hour continuous shifts instead of 2-hour rotations. 4 hours near the raw Sabbaty vein. 4 hours of whatever was causing the burn, doubled from the previous exposure limit. I looked at Gosh. She was nodding slightly, like Ford's pronouncements made perfect sense. I looked at the others. Same response, calm acceptance of protocols that should have triggered immediate complaints or concerns. "Director," I said loud enough to cut through the cafeteria's silence. "Those safety redundancies exist for a reason. If we lose primary monitoring, we need secondary checks to catch failures before they become catastrophic." Ford turned to look at me. His eyes were steady and calm, and I realized he hadn't blinked since entering the room. "The statistical probability of simultaneous primary system failure is 0.03%, he said. "The resource expenditure for secondary checks represents a measurable inefficiency. By eliminating this waste, we increase overall output by 4.6%. The mathematics are not subjective, Mr. Brooks. It's not about statistics, it's about survival margins when things go wrong, and they always go wrong eventually. Your perspective reflects emotional overhead rather than analytical assessment," Ford said, his tone unchanged. "This is noted. You may submit a formal efficiency objection if you wish to challenge the protocols, though I should inform you that all objections will be evaluated against output performance metrics." He wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He was explaining why my concern was irrelevant with the same tone he'd used to describe a malfunctioning component, a problem to be categorized and dismissed. Ford nodded once, precisely, and left the cafeteria. The meal period continued in silence. I looked down at my reduced portion and realized I'd lost my appetite. Around me, the crew finished their food and returned to their assigned stations without a word. Gosh stood to leave. I caught her arm. "Jane, what happened to you? You sound like a diagnostic report, not a person." She looked at my hand on her arm, then at my face. Her expression was neutral, clinical. "I am operating at optimal cognitive efficiency," she said. "The reduction in emotional processing overhead has improved my analytical capacity by 28%. This is measurable. This is good." She paused. "You should consider volunteering for extended level 4 exposure, Tom. It helps clarify priorities." She pulled her arm free and walked out. I sat alone in the cafeteria, surrounded by empty chairs and clean trays, and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The crew wasn't sick. They were optimized. They were thinking more clearly and feeling less, and they saw this as improvement. My personal comm unit buzzed. Emergency code from level 4, drill head pressure spike. I grabbed my toolkit and ran. The descent from level 2 to level 4 took 6 minutes through the reinforced airlock system. Each level was environmentally sealed to prevent cascade failures if one section lost integrity. I punched in my access code and the pressure doors cycled open with a sharp hiss of equalizing atmosphere. Level 4 was different from the rest of the station. The temperature was significantly colder despite the thermal insulation, and there was a weight to the air that had nothing to do with pressure. The drilling platform was a massive structure built into a hollowed chamber in the ice, with the drill head itself descending through a vertical shaft toward the Sabati vein, 2,000 meters below. The equipment here was industrial scale, built to handle extreme force and thermal stress. The alarm was coming from the western support structure. I jogged across the platform and found Rivera pinned under a collapsed brace assembly, his left leg twisted at an angle that made my stomach clench. He was screaming, the sound raw and desperate and completely human. Dr. Gosh was standing 3 meters away, holding a data tablet. 2 other crew members, both drilling engineers, were positioned near the drill head controls, also holding tablets. None of them were helping. "Gosh, get over here and help me get this brace off him." She looked up from the tablet, her expression calm and focused. "The structural collapse represents a critical failure in the support framework," she said. "I am documenting the failure points to prevent recurrence, moving the injured party before completing the assessment risks, compromising the data integrity. He's trapped and bleeding. Document it later." "The drill head is currently offline due to the pressure spike," one of the engineers said. He was consulting his tablet while Rivera screamed 5 meters away. "If we complete the structural assessment now, we can implement repairs and restart operations within 4 hours. If we divert resources to personnel extraction first, the restart timeline extends to 6 hours. I stared at them, at Gosh's clinical focus on her documentation, at the engineers calmly calculating restart timelines while a man bled and screamed, at the complete absence of urgency or concern or basic human response to someone else's pain. "Are you out of your minds?" I moved to the collapsed brace and started assessing the lift points. "He needs medical attention now. Help me move this." No one moved. Gosh continued her documentation. The engineers remained at their stations. I grabbed the brace assembly and tried to lift it. The weight was immense, industrial-grade steel designed to hold the drilling platform stable during high-torque operations. I couldn't move it alone. Rivera's screaming had dissolved into gasping sobs, his face grey with shock. "Please," he said, looking at Gosh. "Jane, please help." Gosh didn't respond. She was zooming in on something on her tablet, taking detailed imagery of the failure point. I looked up at the platform's upper level and saw Director Ford standing on the observation catwalk. He was watching the scene below with his hands clasped behind his back, making no move to intervene or assist. As I watched, he removed his glasses and began cleaning them with a small cloth, his movements precise and unhurried. Something broke inside my head. Not the burn that Rivera had described, but something else. The final failure of a load-bearing point that had been under stress for 8 years. I'd spent almost a decade telling myself that efficiency was survival, that cutting costs and tolerating danger was pragmatic, that keeping your head down and prioritizing the payout was smart. I'd believed that the rig accident had taught me to be harder, colder, more focused on the numbers, but this, watching human beings calculate the optimal time to save someone's life versus restarting a machine, this was where that philosophy ended. This was the logical conclusion of efficiency without empathy, optimization without humanity. I wedged my pry bar under the brace assembly and used my body weight as leverage. The steel groaned but shifted slightly. I repositioned and tried again, muscles burning with effort. Rivera gasped as the pressure on his leg decreased fractionally. "Tom, you're compromising the restart timeline," one of the engineers said. He sounded concerned, but only about the timeline. "You should return to your station and allow us to complete the assessment." "Go to hell," I said, and threw all my weight against the bar. The brace shifted enough for Rivera to drag himself free. His leg was crushed below the knee, bone visible through torn flesh. I grabbed him under the arms and started pulling him toward the airlock that led back to level 3. He was heavy and struggling to help, his weight sending sharp pain through my lower back with each step. Gosh moved to block my path. "Moving him compromises the restart timeline," she said, her voice flat and reasonable. "Leave him and return to your station. We can implement personnel extraction after completing the critical assessment." "Get out of my way, Jane. Your emotional response is creating an inefficiency. The optimal solution is—" I shoved past her, half carrying Rivera toward the airlock. Behind me, Ford's voice came through the platform's speaker system, amplified and calm. "Mr. Brooks, your actions are being noted as a disruption to operational protocols. Return to your assigned station immediately." I kept moving, reached the airlock control panel and punched in the emergency override code. The pressure door cycled open. I dragged Rivera through and hit the button to seal the door behind us. Through the closing gap, I saw Gosh and the engineers already returning to their documentation. Saw Ford still standing on the observation catwalk, replacing his glasses. And I understood, finally, what I was dealing with. The crew wasn't sick. They weren't stressed. They were thinking with perfect, terrible clarity. A cold logic that calculated human life as a variable to be optimized against operational efficiency. The burn wasn't destroying their minds. It was burning away everything that made them human and leaving behind something that thought more clearly and felt nothing at all. The medical bay was on level 2, adjacent to the administration offices. I got Rivera onto one of the examination tables and immediately started looking for Patterson, the station medic. He was in the supply room counting inventory with a handheld scanner. "Patterson, I need you. Rivera's got a compound fracture, possible internal bleeding." Patterson looked up from his scanner, registered Rivera's condition with a brief glance, then walked over. His movements were efficient and practiced, but there was something mechanical about them, the way you'd watch a robotic arm complete a pre-programmed task. He examined the leg, pulled out a medical injector, and administered what I assumed was a sedative. "Damage is consistent with crush injury from industrial equipment," Patterson said. He was setting up a portable scanner while he spoke, his tone clinical and detached. "The fracture requires surgical stabilization but can wait until the current operational cycle completes. Excessive pain medication would reduce his cognitive capacity unnecessarily. I will administer minimal sedation to maintain consciousness and provide basic wound sealing. He needs surgery now, not later. Surgery requires a 4-hour commitment and complete focus. Performing it during peak operational hours creates an inefficiency in medical resource allocation. The injury is not immediately fatal. Optimal scheduling places the procedure at 2200 hours, when my attention is not required for routine crew monitoring." Rivera was trying to speak through the sedative's effects, his words slurred but urgent. "Tom, something wrong with them. Wrong with all of them." I looked at Patterson's face and saw the same empty focus I'd seen in Gosh, present and functional but fundamentally absent in some crucial way. He was treating Rivera's crushed leg like a maintenance ticket to be scheduled around more important tasks. Do the surgery now or I'll report this as medical negligence. Report to whom? Patterson asked. The question wasn't defensive or concerned. He genuinely wanted to know who I thought would care about my complaint. Director Ford has approved all current medical protocols as optimal for station efficiency. He returned to sealing Rivera's wound. I left him there and moved to the medical bay's computer terminal. If the crew had been experiencing the burn for 3 weeks, there had to be documentation. Medical facilities kept detailed health records. The terminal required Patterson's credentials. I glanced back at him. He was focused entirely on Rivera's leg, moving with that same disturbing efficiency. I tried the default password that most station systems shipped with, the one that lazy administrators never bothered to change. It worked. The medical database opened and I started searching for recent crew health assessments. What I found made my hands go cold. Neurological scans, complete brain activity mapping for every member of the station, updated weekly for the past month. The scans showed detailed imagery of neural activity with color-coded regions indicating function levels. I didn't have the medical training to interpret most of it, but the system included automated analysis notes. Every single crew member showed suppressed activity in specific brain regions. The notes identified them as the frontal cortex and temporal lobes, areas associated with emotional processing, empathy, and long-term consequence evaluation. The suppression increased with longer exposure to level 4 operations. Ford's scans showed the most severe suppression, with activity in those regions reduced by nearly 60% compared to baseline measurements taken when the operation started. The automated analysis flagged this as critical neurological degradation, requiring immediate medical intervention and cessation of exposure to the causative agent. Patterson had overridden every single alert and marked them as acceptable operational variants. I scrolled further and found a suppressed communication file, an email draft that had never been sent. It was written by the previous chief engineer, a man named Morrison, who'd been evacuated 2 weeks ago. The official story was that he'd suffered a psychological breakdown from isolation stress. The email told a different story. Morrison had discovered the same neurological scans I was looking at. He'd reported the cognitive effects to Ford and demanded immediate shutdown of the extraction process until the cause could be identified. Ford had responded by increasing Morrison's level 4 exposure time and documenting him as suffering from paranoid delusions. When Morrison tried to send an emergency communication to the corporate oversight office, he found all external communications locked behind Ford's authorization. The email ended with Morrison stating he was going to physically disable the communications array to force an emergency evacuation protocol. 2 days later, he was sedated and removed from the station. I looked up at Patterson. Did you know about this? The neurological damage. The cognitive modifications are well documented, he said without turning from Rivera's leg. Initial assessment suggested they represented pathological degradation. Subsequent analysis revealed measurable improvements in logical processing, task focus, and decision-making speed. Director Ford reclassified the modifications as beneficial adaptation rather than damage. I concur with this assessment. You're talking about the loss of empathy like it's a system upgrade. Empathy is a resource-intensive cognitive process that frequently conflicts with optimal decision-making. Its reduction creates measurable efficiency gains. He finished sealing the wound and stepped back to examine his work. You should consider this for yourself. The clarity is remarkable. Problems that once seemed complex become simple matters of calculation. The constant weight of emotional consideration disappears. Rivera was unconscious now, either from the sedative or shock. I tried the medical bay's communication terminal, hoping to send an emergency signal to the supply ship that was scheduled to arrive in 6 weeks. The system showed all external communications routed through Ford's personal authorization. Every channel, emergency frequencies, standard data uplinks, even the automated beacon that was supposed to broadcast the station's status continuously. All of it locked behind administrative access I didn't have. Morrison had tried to force an evacuation by disabling communications. Ford had anticipated that and locked him out first. I pulled up the neurological scans again and found my own file. My scan showed normal activity levels in all regions. Whatever was causing the cognitive changes, I hadn't been exposed long enough for it to take effect. I'd spent most of my time on level 3, maintaining equipment, while the drilling crews rotated through extended shifts near the Sabbatee vein on level 4. There was a handwritten note attached to my file in Ford's recognizable, precise script. Subject shows persistent resistance to optimization protocols. Recommend extended level 4 exposure therapy. Emotional inefficiency threatens operational cohesion. I heard footsteps in the corridor outside the medical bay, multiple people moving with synchronized purpose. I shut down the terminal and moved to the door, looking through the observation window. Gosh was in the hallway with 2 drilling engineers I recognized, Hernandez and Park. They were moving toward the medical bay with the calm, methodical approach of people executing a planned task. Gosh was carrying a tablet. The others had access cards ready. I backed away from the door and looked for another exit. The medical bay had 2 entrances, the main corridor and a secondary door that led to the emergency supply storage. I grabbed Rivera's shoulder and shook him, trying to wake him. He mumbled something incoherent but didn't regain consciousness. "Patterson, they're coming for me. Help me move him." Patterson looked at me with that empty, clinical expression. Moving an unconscious patient risks additional injury. The optimal choice is to leave him here while you address whatever administrative issue has arisen. The main door opened. Gosh walked in first, her movements unhurried and deliberate. Hernandez and Park followed, positioning themselves to block both exits. I was trapped in the medical bay with an unconscious man and 3 crew members who'd been optimized into something that looked human, but calculated like machinery. "Thomas," Gosh said. Her voice was calm and measured, the same tone she'd used to explain a geological survey. "Your recent behavior has been flagged as operationally concerning. You demonstrated emotional override of logical protocols on level 4, prioritizing individual welfare over system efficiency. This pattern suggests you are experiencing cognitive resistance to optimization. I'm experiencing basic human decency. You let Rivera scream in pain while you documented failure points. His pain was subjective discomfort. The structural failure represented measurable risk to station operations. Prioritization was logical. It was monstrous. It was efficient." She consulted her tablet. "Director Ford has recommended extended exposure therapy to address your emotional inefficiency. You need to accompany us to level 4 for an immediate optimization session." I understood what she was saying. They wanted to expose me to whatever was causing the burn until my brain showed the same suppressed activity theirs did. Until I stopped caring about anything except output metrics and optimal efficiency. "I'm not going anywhere with you." "Your cooperation is not required," Hernandez said. He was a large man, built for heavy labor. "Director Ford has authorized physical intervention if you resist therapeutic protocols." I looked at the medical equipment around me. Heavy machinery designed to be bolted down. Nothing useful as a weapon except maybe the portable scanner. The emergency supply storage behind me contained medical gear and environmental suits, but no exit. The only way out was through 3 people who wouldn't hesitate to hurt me because hesitation was inefficient. "You're going to force me down to level 4 and expose me to whatever's destroying your ability to care about anything. We are going to help you achieve optimal cognitive function," Gosh said. "The emotional overhead you're experiencing is a burden. We're offering you relief from that burden." They moved toward me in synchronized coordination. I grabbed the portable scanner and threw it at Hernandez, then rushed for the emergency supply storage. Made it through the door and slammed it shut, engaging the manual lock. The door was designed to seal in case of medical quarantine. Solid construction meant to contain biological hazards. I heard them testing the door handle. No panic, no frustration, just calm assessment of the obstacle. "Thomas, this is creating unnecessary delay," Gosh said through the door. "The storage room has no exit. You have simply moved from one contained space to another. The logical choice is to open the door and accept the therapeutic intervention." I looked around the storage room. Medical supplies, environmental suits, emergency oxygen tanks, and a maintenance access panel in the floor that led to the service tunnels running between levels. The tunnels were narrow passages used for running cables and pipes between sections, barely large enough for a person to crawl through. I'd used them before when working on systems that needed access from multiple levels. I pulled up the access panel and dropped into the tunnel. The space was tight and dark, lit only by emergency guidance strips that ran along the floor. I could hear Gosh and the others working on the storage room door above me. Systematic, patient work. They'd get through eventually. They had time and tools and no emotional urgency to make them rush or panic. The service tunnels connected all 4 levels through a network of vertical shafts and horizontal passages. I crawled toward level 3, toward my workshop where I kept my personal tools and equipment. If I was going to survive this, I needed to understand what I was fighting and how to stop it. The crawl took 15 minutes. My shoulders scraped against the tunnel walls and my knees ached from the hard surface. But the discomfort kept me focused. The alternative was thinking about what I'd seen in those neurological scans, the systematic destruction of everything that made the crew human, documented and accepted as beneficial adaptation. I emerged through a maintenance hatch directly into my workshop. The room was as I'd left it, tools organized on the workbench, the stabilization coil monitoring station displaying its steady 6-degree temperature variance. I locked the workshop door and activated the emergency lockdown protocol, a safety feature that sealed the room in case of fire or pressure loss. The locks were mechanical and robust, designed to contain industrial accidents. It would buy me time. Not much, but enough to think. I pulled up the workshop's engineering terminal and accessed the stabilization coil schematics. If the Saberti extraction was causing the neurological damage, the coil was the critical component in that process. The coil took raw energy from the drilling operation and regulated it for station use, a massive piece of engineering that sat at the intersection of the drill head's output and the station's power distribution network. The schematics showed the coil's thermal damping system, a series of cooling arrays that kept the massive energy transfer from overheating the equipment. The dampers could be reversed. Instead of cooling the coil, they could heat it, force a deliberate overload that would cause catastrophic feedback through the extraction system. It would destroy the Saberti operation, melt the coil beyond repair, and force an emergency shutdown of the entire drilling platform. The facility would survive. The power system still had redundancy even with Ford placing backups in standby, but the extraction would be dead for months. Maybe permanently if the feedback damaged the drill head itself. It would also void my contract. Deliberate sabotage wasn't covered by insurance. I'd be liable for damages that would dwarf anything I owed already. The $200,000 I'd come here to earn would become debt instead of salvation. I'd be worse than broke. I'd be permanently destroyed financially. I pulled the contract from my pocket and looked at the numbers again. Thought about Liam in his wheelchair, about my parents' care home, about my nephew's education fund. Thought about 8 years of working in bad places for dangerous pay, convinced that the only way to fix what I'd broken was to break myself in the process. Thought about Rivera screaming while Gosh documented failure points. The lights in my workshop went out. Emergency strips activated automatically, providing dim illumination. Gosh's voice came through the workshop's intercom system. "Thomas, we have initiated power reallocation protocols. Your workshop is no longer designated as an essential zone. Environmental support will be reduced in stages until you emerge and accept therapeutic intervention." I looked at the temperature gauge. already dropping. They were cutting life support to force me out. I grabbed my thermal gear and started pulling it on, buying myself a few more hours before the cold became critical. Ford's voice replaced Gosh's on the intercom. "Mr. Brooks, I want you to understand something. I am not angry with you. I do not bear you any personal hostility. I simply recognize that your emotional inefficiency is creating measurable disruption to station operations. This is a problem that requires correction." I didn't respond. I was pulling up financial projections on the terminal, running calculations. "I have your contract details here," Ford continued. $200,000 for 18 weeks of work. You have 14 weeks remaining, which represents $163,000 in remaining compensation. If you continue your current resistance, your contract will be voided for cause and you will receive nothing. Additionally, you will be liable for damages resulting from your operational disruptions. I estimate your final debt at approximately $247,000. He was weaponizing my deepest fear. The terror of returning to bankruptcy and watching everyone who depended on me suffer because I'd failed again. "However, I am prepared to offer you an alternative," Ford said. "Cease your resistance immediately. Accept a 30-day evaluation period during which you will complete therapeutic exposure protocols. If you demonstrate adequate cognitive optimization within that timeframe, your contract will continue. If you do not optimize successfully, you will be evacuated with partial compensation, $60,000 for time served. This is a logical compromise that protects both your financial interests and station operations." The offer was carefully calculated. $60,000 wouldn't solve my problems, but it would prevent them from getting catastrophically worse. It was enough to keep my parents in their care home for another year. Enough to delay the worst consequences while I figured out the next desperate job. All I had to do was let them burn away everything in my head that made me care about people like Rivera. "You have 3 minutes to consider this offer," Ford said. "After that, I will classify you as an active threat to station security and authorize permanent containment. This is not personal. This is mathematics." I looked at the stabilization coil schematics on my screen, looked at the thermal dampener controls, looked at my contract with its promise of financial salvation. I'd spent 8 years believing that the rig accident taught me a lesson about weakness and inefficiency, that caring too much about the injured worker had been the problem, not the budget cuts that caused the accident in the first place. I'd convinced myself that becoming harder and colder was survival, that sacrificing safety and sentiment for money was pragmatic rather than cowardly. But Ford's optimized crew wasn't pragmatic. They were exactly what I'd been trying to become, perfectly efficient machines that calculated the value of human life in output metrics and restart timelines. They were the logical endpoint of every choice I'd made for 8 years, and I finally understood that the rig accident hadn't broken me. My response to it had. The problem wasn't that I'd cared about the injured worker. The problem was that I'd decided caring was the flaw instead of the budget cuts that prioritized profit over safety. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to throw away $200,000, I said quietly, knowing no one could hear me. "That probably makes me worse than them. They can't help what they've become. I can still choose." The temperature was dropping steadily. I checked my thermal suit's power supply. Good for 6 hours. After that, the cold would start causing real damage. I accessed the service tunnel schematics and found a route to level 4 that bypassed the main corridors. It would take an hour of crawling through maintenance spaces, but I could reach the stabilization coil access point without encountering the optimized crew. The terminal chimed. A message from Ford appeared on screen. "Your time has expired. Containment protocols authorized." I heard movement outside the workshop. Multiple people working on the mechanical locks with systematic patience. I grabbed my personal toolkit, the heavy wrench, the welding torch, the tension monitors, and dropped back into the service tunnels. The crawl to level 4 was longer and harder than the previous route. The tunnels grew colder as I descended. the walls filmed with condensation that turned to ice. My shoulders cramped from the confined space and my knees went numb from constant contact with the frozen metal floor. I focused on the mechanics of movement. Pull with your arms, push with your legs. Don't think about the debt or the family or the fact that you're about to destroy the only way you have to save any of them. Don't think about whether sabotaging the coil will even work, or if you'll just create a bigger catastrophe. Don't think about the fact that you're 54 years old, and after this, you'll be starting from worse than zero. The tunnel opened into a maintenance shaft that ran parallel to the level 4 drilling platform. I could hear the drill head's operation through the walls. The Sabati extraction was running at full capacity, pulling ancient energy from the ice and pumping it through the coil where it transformed into usable power, where it also radiated whatever was burning the empathy out of the crew's brains. I emerged from the shaft into a secondary equipment room adjacent to the main platform. The room housed backup control systems and auxiliary machinery. The stabilization coil access point was supposed to be here, a maintenance interface that allowed direct control of the thermal damping system. Gosh was standing next to the access point, tablet in hand. Hernandez and Park flanked the only exit. They'd anticipated my route, calculated where I'd emerge and positioned themselves accordingly. They weren't surprised or angry. They'd just solved the problem of my location through logical deduction. "Hello, Thomas," Gosh said. "We predicted you would attempt to access the stabilization coil. The service tunnel route was the most probable approach given your familiarity with the facility layout. This is interesting data about human predictability under stress." I looked at the three of them blocking my path to either escape or success. Looked at the coil access point behind Gosh, calculated my chances of fighting through them, and decided the math was bad. Jane, somewhere in your head, you're still in there. The person who talked about her daughter and laughed at bad jokes. You're just buried under whatever this place did to your brain. "I am more myself now than I have ever been," Gosh said. "The constant noise of emotional consideration is gone. I make decisions based on data rather than sentiment. It is liberating. It's horrifying, only from the perspective of someone still burdened by inefficient cognitive processing." She took a step toward me. "You are afraid of what we've become because you see it as loss. We see it as gain. You could see it that way too, if you stopped resisting." The drill head's vibration intensified. I felt it through my boots, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to push into my skull. The burn that Rivera had described, a physical pressure that wanted to clarify my thoughts into cold, efficient logic. The door behind Hernandez and Park opened. Rivera stumbled through, his crushed leg dragging, his face grey with pain and determination. He was carrying a heavy pipe wrench from the platform maintenance stores. "Tom, get to the coil," he said. "I've got them." Gosh turned to assess this new variable. Hernandez moved toward Rivera with calm purpose. Rivera swung the wrench in a wide arc that connected with Hernandez's knee. The man went down without crying out, already calculating how to work around the damaged joint. I ran for the coil access point. Park moved to intercept, but Rivera threw the wrench at his head, forcing him to dodge. I reached the control interface and pulled up the thermal dampener settings. Gosh grabbed my shoulder and tried to pull me away from the controls. I shoved her back and she came at me again with systematic persistence. No anger or frustration, just the single-minded focus of someone executing a necessary task. Behind me, Rivera was still fighting. I heard the impact of metal on flesh, heard him gasping with effort, heard Hernandez explaining calmly that continued resistance would result in additional injury. I accessed the dampener controls and found the reversal protocol buried in the emergency systems. The interface required a confirmation code, a safety feature to prevent accidental activation. I started entering my maintenance credentials. Gosh pulled me away from the interface. We struggled, her strength surprising for her size, fueled by absolute commitment, uncompromised by doubt or hesitation. I got an elbow into her ribs, and she released me just long enough for me to finish entering the code. The reversal protocol activated. The stabilization coil's cooling systems shut down. The thermal dampers began pumping heat instead of removing it. The coil's temperature started climbing immediately. Alarms shrieked through the facility. The drill head's vibration pattern changed, becoming erratic as the power regulation failed. I looked at the temperature gauge and watched it spike past safety limits into catastrophic territory. The coil was melting. The operation was dead. So was my contract. So was any hope of financial recovery. I'd just destroyed myself to save people who would probably never understand why. Gosh released me and stepped back, staring at the failing coil readings on her tablet. For a moment, something shifted in her expression. Confusion or horror breaking through the optimized clarity. Then she screamed, a raw sound of absolute anguish that had nothing to do with station operations or efficiency metrics. The cognitive burn was fading with the coil's failure. The pressure in my skull disappeared. Around me, Hernandez and Park started moving like humans again, confused, hurt, horrified by what they'd been doing. Rivera collapsed against the wall, breathing hard, his leg bleeding through Patterson's hasty seals. I helped him stand and we moved toward the emergency exit as the alarms continued and the stabilization coil tore itself apart. Ford appeared in the doorway as the stabilization coil's temperature gauge passed critical failure. He wasn't running or panicking. He walked into the equipment room with his usual measured pace, observing the catastrophic readings on the monitoring screens with what looked like academic interest. "Mr. Brooks," he said over the alarms, "you have initiated a feedback cascade that will result in total coil failure within 8 minutes. The Sabotage extraction is now permanently compromised. Repair timeline is estimated at 6 months minimum, assuming salvageable components remain after thermal breakdown." I was helping Rivera stay upright. Gosh had collapsed to her knees, staring at her hands like she didn't recognize them. Hernandez and Park were backing away from us with expressions of mounting horror as they remembered what they'd been doing for the past 3 weeks. "I know what I did," I said. Ford removed his glasses and began cleaning them. The same precise, economical movement I'd watched from the observation catwalk when Rivera was screaming. His hands were steady despite the alarms and the failing systems and the operation collapsing around him. "I have your contract details here," he said, producing a tablet. "The sabotage clause is quite specific. Deliberate destruction of company assets voids all compensation and assigns liability for damages. Adding facility downtime, lost revenue projections, and emergency response costs, your personal liability is assessed at $247,000. He turned the tablet toward me. The numbers were there in detailed breakdown, every dollar I now owed instead of earned. "You came here to earn money to support your family and compensate the man you injured in Canada," Ford continued. "You have now guaranteed their financial suffering. Your parents will lose their care facility. The injured man will lose his medical trust. Your nephews will lose their education funding. This is the direct consequence of your choice to prioritize sentiment over logic." The coil's temperature was still climbing. I could feel the heat radiating through the walls now, the thermal dampers pumping energy into a system designed to regulate it. The metal was beginning to warp. "I'm aware of the consequences." "Then why?" Ford's question wasn't angry or accusatory. He genuinely wanted to understand the calculation that led to my choice. "You could have accepted the optimization, continued your contract, earned enough to secure everyone who depends on you. Instead, you chose to destroy yourself financially for people who were already adapting successfully to improved cognitive function." "They weren't adapting. They were dying." Ford replaced his glasses and looked at me with something that might have been sadness if his emotional processing wasn't suppressed by 60%. "The reduction of empathy is not death, Mr. Brooks. It is efficiency. It is the removal of cognitive overhead that prevents optimal decision-making. You saw it as loss because you are still burdened by that overhead." The alarms shifted pitch. The coil was approaching total failure. Emergency evacuation protocols activated automatically, lights shifting to red and directional markers illuminating the path to the surface hangar. "I have been documenting this operation for a month," Ford said. "The cognitive modifications caused by Saber-T exposure represent a breakthrough in human optimization. Corporate interests have already expressed strong desire to replicate this technology. If you had not sabotaged the coil, we could have extracted enough Saber-T material to begin global operations within 2 years. Energy independence and cognitive enhancement deployed worldwide." "You mean burning the empathy out of people's brains worldwide?" "I mean freeing humanity from the inefficiencies that have plagued our species since we developed complex emotional processing. Imagine a world where decisions are made based on data rather than sentiment, where resources are allocated logically rather than emotionally, where the constant burden of caring about subjective suffering is replaced by objective optimization." He wasn't trying to convince me. He was explaining why my sabotage was ultimately futile, and he was probably right. The technology would resurface somewhere else. Some other company would find another Saber-T vein or develop another method to achieve the same cognitive modifications. I'd stopped it here, in this facility, for these 18 people. That was all. "You said something interesting earlier," I said. "You asked me why. You wanted to understand the logic of my choice. But there isn't logic. That's the point. I chose to destroy myself financially because seeing Rivera scream while Gosh documented failure points made me feel something you can't anymore. Horror. Grief. The irrational, inefficient understanding that some things matter more than optimal outcomes." Ford looked at me for a long moment. The coil's temperature gauge redlined and the metal began to shriek as the structural integrity failed. "This proves my thesis," he said quietly. "Inefficiency wins because it is willing to destroy itself to prevent optimization. It is a paradox. The very qualities I am trying to eliminate are the ones that give you the capacity to sacrifice everything to preserve them." He turned and walked toward the emergency exit. As he reached the doorway, he looked back. "Your choice will haunt you, Mr. Brooks. Every time you cannot afford something your family needs. Every time you face the consequences of poverty you chose. You will wonder if the cost was worth it. I already know the answer. It was not." Then he was gone, moving toward the evacuation point with mechanical efficiency, even as his optimization collapsed around him. The stabilization coil exploded. A catastrophic structural failure that sent superheated metal fragmenting through containment shields that were never designed to handle deliberate overload. The sound was massive and immediate, like a physical blow to the chest. The equipment room filled with heat and pressure, and I threw myself over Rivera as rubble rained down. When the noise stopped, I looked up. The monitoring screens were dead. The alarms had shifted to emergency power mode. The drill head's vibration was gone. The entire Saber-T extraction had shut down when the coil failed. The ancient energy source was still there, buried 2,000 meters in the ice, but humanity's ability to harvest it was destroyed. Gosh was standing now, looking at her tablet like she couldn't understand what she was reading. The neurological monitoring data was normalizing as the cognitive burn faded. Her frontal cortex activity was returning to baseline. She was becoming human again, and the horror of what she'd almost done was written across her face. "I told you to leave him," she whispered. "I calculated the optimal timeline and I told you to leave Rivera under the collapsed brace while I documented the failure points. You weren't yourself. I was exactly myself, just the parts of myself I usually suppress because they're cruel and efficient and wrong." She looked at me with tears starting. "How do you come back from that? How do I go home and look at my daughter knowing I was capable of watching someone scream in pain and feeling nothing except impatience about restart timelines?" I didn't have an answer for her. I helped Rivera to his feet and we moved toward the emergency exit, following the directional markers toward the surface hangar. Behind us, The Level 4 drilling platform was already being sealed by automated safety systems. The failed coil contained behind reinforced doors that would hold until engineers could assess the damage months from now. The evacuation took 2 hours. The entire station complement gathered at the surface hangar. 18 people in various states of confusion and horror as their cognitive optimization faded and they remembered what they'd been doing. Patterson kept apologizing to Rivera for scheduling his surgery around operational efficiency. The drilling engineers couldn't stop talking about how they'd calculated his injury against restart timelines. Gosh sat alone, staring at nothing. Ford was the last to arrive at the hangar. He'd stopped in his office to gather documentation, even in the midst of catastrophic facility failure. He had files and data storage devices organized in a precise stack. When the security team that arrived with the emergency response craft tried to detain him, he went calmly, explaining in measured tones that his actions were entirely logical and that the neurological data would prove the value of the optimization protocols. They sedated him eventually. Even then, he was calculating efficiency metrics in his sleep. 3 days later, I sat in the surface hangar waiting for the transport that would take the crew back to civilization. My hands were bandaged from thermal burns I'd gotten during the coil failure, the skin underneath healing slowly and leaving scars that would be permanent. The kind of physical damage that shows up in cold weather and reminds you of the moment you destroyed your entire financial future. The contract termination paperwork was in front of me. I'd read through it twice already, but kept coming back to the final page where the debt was itemized. $247,000 in liability. 0 compensation for time served. My signature required at the bottom. I signed it. Rivera was sitting nearby, his crushed leg immobilized in a surgical cast. Patterson had performed the operation 2 days ago with human care and precision, staying with him through recovery instead of calculating optimal resource allocation. The leg would heal, eventually. Rivera would walk again. He'd live because I'd made the choice to drag him away from people who saw his injury as a timeline disruption. Gosh approached slowly, like she wasn't sure she was welcome. Her tablet was gone. She'd thrown it into the ice the first day after evacuation, said she couldn't look at the data without seeing the person she'd become. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "I know that's inadequate. You destroyed yourself financially to save us from something we'd already accepted. But thank you. I didn't do it to be thanked. I know, that's why it matters." She sat down next to me, careful to maintain distance. "They're burying it. The corporate lawyers, all the neurological data, Ford's documentation, the evidence of what the Saba-T exposure does to human cognition. They're classifying it as proprietary research and sealing the files. By the time we get back to civilization, the official story will be equipment failure and psychological stress from isolation." I figured they would. Ford was right about one thing. The technology will resurface. Some other company will find another way to achieve the same cognitive modifications, or they'll just drill into a different Saba-T vein in a different location. You stopped it here. You didn't stop it forever. I looked at my bandaged hands and thought about the permanent scars forming underneath. Thought about the debt that would follow me for the rest of my life. Thought about my parents losing their care home and Liam losing his medical trust and my nephews losing their education funding. "I know," I said. "But here is all I had access to. This facility, these 18 people, this moment. I couldn't stop the technology from existing. I could only stop it from taking you." Gosh was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was steady, but I could hear the weight underneath. "My daughter is 7. When I video called her 2 weeks ago, I calculated the optimal conversation length based on bandwidth costs and educational value. I ended the call after 4 minutes because additional time represented inefficient emotional indulgence." She looked at her empty hands. I told her I had to go. She said she loved me, and I responded with an acknowledgement of the statement rather than reciprocation because reciprocation served no measurable function. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't minimize what she'd lost and regained. I get to go home and hug her now, Gosh said. I get to waste bandwidth on inefficient emotional indulgence for the rest of my life. That has value you can't measure in currency. The transport arrived. A heavy-lift craft designed for personnel evacuation, corporate logos on the hull, crew that maintained professional distance from the people they were collecting. I gathered my toolkit, the same worn bag I'd brought 4 months ago, the same tools I'd maintained and trusted through 2 decades of industrial work. Ford was being transported separately, sedated and restrained, still property of the corporation that had funded his optimization experiment. The security team said he'd been talking in his sleep, calculating efficiency metrics and optimal resource allocation even as his brain slowly recovered from months of cognitive damage. I wondered if he'd ever fully recover, if the empathy that burned away could regrow, or if he'd spend the rest of his life seeing human emotions as inefficiency that needed correction. Rivera hobbled onto the transport ahead of me, using crutches that Patterson had fabricated from equipment stores. He'd live. He'd heal. He'd probably have a limp for the rest of his life, but he'd exist as something more than a timeline disruption in someone else's operational calculations. I was the last to board. I stood at the transport's entry ramp and looked back at Station Lambda one final time. The facility was still standing, the surface structures intact, but everything below was sealed and dead. The Sabati vein remained buried in the ice, generating its ancient energy in darkness, waiting for the next people desperate or ambitious enough to drill down and harvest it. The technology would resurface. Ford was right about that. Somewhere else, someone would find another way to burn away human empathy in the name of optimization and efficiency. They'd call it cognitive enhancement or evolutionary adaptation, or whatever term made it sound like progress instead of mutilation. And when it happened again, maybe someone else would be willing to sacrifice everything to stop it. Or maybe they wouldn't. Maybe eventually humanity would decide that feeling less was worth the increased productivity, that caring about subjective suffering was overhead they could no longer afford. I didn't know. I only knew what I'd done here, in this moment, with the access I had.